a living history production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome to BattleWalks. Thank you for joining us on another episode as we walk through the great battlefields of Europe. If you haven't tuned into recent episodes, please do. We've had ones on D-Day, we've had ones on the Somme, we've had the Ypres Salient, we've had all manner of interesting battlefields that we've virtually walked in this new series. A recent one that was really popular was the battlefield of Agincourt, from a bit more of an ancient battle. That was a really popular download, so I think people are really getting on board with what we're doing, which is incredibly gratifying. As I said, Pete and I started this to fill in a little bit of time during lockdown when we couldn't get out and walk the ground, and it's just wonderful that so many people are joining us on this journey. So thank you for tuning in and joining us on BattleWalks. And joining me, of course, as always, is Pete Smith. Pete, welcome.
Thank you, Matt. Good to be back again.
Mate, one that's right up your alley this week, a little bit different from me. I have been to this area a few times, but I have not explored it in the detail we're going to today. So I'm really excited, as I hope all our listeners are. We're doing Le Cateau, a battle from very, very early in the walk, and it's just a really interesting chapter of the First World War.
It's in the middle of nowhere, so I have to say it's not one that I regularly go to. I take individual clients who sometimes want to follow in the footsteps to the battlefield itself. You can tie it in with Mons, which we'll talk about, the very first action for the British Army in World War One. So it's a great area, and it's also in an area that wasn't utterly obliterated. So it's quite nice for myself. I live in an area that was flattened to go to a town, to a small town that actually has buildings that go beyond 1920.
Tell me about this chapter of the war, because you mentioned Mons, and then there's also Le Cateau, the first two earliest actions the British Army were involved in during the First World War. So we're talking August 1914, in the opening weeks of the First World War. Just give us an overview of what the British Army was doing at the start of the First World War and their introduction to fighting on the Western Front.
Well, their introduction is going to be because of the German attempt to take France and Paris, and of course that's the key. Happened in 1870-71. They took Paris and France capitulated and they got what they wanted. So this is really what they're aiming to do here. It's the Schlieffen Plan, difficult word to say, Schlieffen Plan, which is a plan that had existed for quite some time and had been tweaked and updated. And it's an enormous swing, sometimes described as the right hook, coming from Germany, swinging through Belgium. They often describe it that the German soldier on the extreme right, his cuff would touch the channel, so that's the English channel, and then they would swing in through Belgium into France and round Paris. So that was the German plan, very basically. It's not going to work. It's not going to go according to plan. That's partly due to French resistance, Belgian resistance, and the British Army being thrown in. And the British Army will meet them, first of all, at Mons. Very famous, the fighting at Mons. So I'm just going to give you an idea of that mobilisation. That's what it's called when an army prepares for war and gathers itself, as to exactly what happened. So the date that that Britain entered the Great War, the 4th of August in 1914. And the army mobilises on the 8th of August. So in other words, they call up the reservists. I'll explain what that means. They pull, the men are pulled together. Of course, the big issue is that a good percentage of the British Army is abroad. It's serving in India, in Burma, in wherever, all around the empire. Malta, just Gibraltar, wherever. And effectively, every regiment has 2 battalions, and one should be in England and one should be around the empire. So that's normally how it works. So this is not the whole of the army that is mobilising. It is that is available, which is based in England. So the 8th of August, we get that mobilisation. By the 13th of August, they're actually in France. By the 16th of August, following several long marches, they're getting towards the front. And by the 22nd of August, just days before the Battle of Mons, they are actually there at Mons. And that's where they get to. So if you just think about it, from a non-war footing to a war footing to being shipped to France less than a month. One of the big issues is the regular army, even very professional, well-trained, a really, really good but very small army, still wasn't up to full strength, and that's why you have the Army Reserve. So I'm just going to give you these numbers. 247,500 regular soldiers. So 247, let's just stick to the 247. 247 regular soldiers. We have 145,000 army reservists, and these are men who had served in the army and were then, within their 5 years of leaving, are held in the reserve. So in other words, after five years, you're then finished completely, but for 5 years after you've served, you can be called back, and so those are the army reserves. And then we have the special reserve, and the 64,000 of those men, and those are men who have particularly signed up to serve in the army if they are needed. And normally what that entailed was 6 months of training, and then they enlisted for 6 years, and they could be called up within those 6 years. So you have to think about it a little bit. Those men, 6 months of training, then called up, not particularly well trained, and an awful lot of the army reservists, if they'd done the full, 22 or let's say 20 odd years, then they're going to be getting on a bit, and they may have been out for a further 4 years, still within their 5 years, and they're going to be called up and a little bit out of shape. Let's put it that way. So we have the regular army bolstered by the Army Reserve and the Special Reserve. And so what that meant that some of the guys are not as fit as they should have been, and yet they will all be able to shoot. So I'll just go on to that because this is very important for what is coming. Is a trained soldier is trained to hit a man-sized target at 300 yards, and he can hit it 15 times in a minute. And that was actually known as the Mad Minute, and it's part of their training. It was known as Practice Number 22, Rapid Fire. And so it was a really important part of the soldiers' training. We really took we thought it was very important that an English soldier, a British soldier, could shoot very well. I must say British, an awful lot of Scots and Irish in the army at this time. So they could shoot very, very well. And this will help them in what is coming, because they are going to be completely overwhelmed by an enormous national army, because the German army is effectively a national army. Every single adult male has been military trained and called up for this war effectively.
I think it's really important that we point that out, Pete, because obviously the two elements are the quantity of soldiers you can put into the field, but also the quality of those soldiers. And you'd have to say, looking at the British Army with less than 500,000 troops across all, including the reserves, including the regular army, it's a very small component when you think that the French and the Germans and the Russians were ready in August 1914 to commit literally millions of troops. The quantity of British soldiers involved in the early days of the war was pretty small. Obviously, it grew very rapidly from this point onwards. But you would have to say, in spite of some of the lack of fitness of some of the reservists, that in terms of quality, they were good fighting men, weren't they?
Oh, indeed. A little let down by some of their kits, because even that's not necessarily correct. They'd been issued an awful lot of new kit, because it was thought, right, get them all kitted out well, issue the new kit, the new boots, etc. New boots, not ideal for marching. And so this is going to be a kind of recurring theme, that they're going to be doing a lot of marching, an awful lot of miles in France towards, and then a strategic withdrawal. I kid myself. They are definitely retreating in this case, falling back. So an awful lot of marching, and an awful lot of men are going to find it very, very difficult.
So talk to us about that early arrival in France, Pete, because, let's talk about the phrase "old contemptibles" as well, which is a phrase that they wore as a badge of honour. How did that even come about in the first place?
Sadly, a lot of these things that we've learned from school and just from watching documentaries are not necessarily true. And the old contemptible is sadly one of those issues. I still use the term; it's a very good term, and the men themselves knew and called themselves the old contemptibles. It was believed to have been spoken about by the Kaiser himself, that he would crush this little contemptible army, this British army. We're fairly certain that he didn't ever say such a thing, and it's almost certainly a bit of PR from the British point of view, trying to G up, really, I suppose, and to get that feeling of how well we're doing, and this very small army doing unbelievably well. So, but the men themselves, they picked upon it, and they became known as the Old Contemptibles. And after the war, many associations were formed of Old Contemptibles, branches all over the country, of these men that saw themselves as something a little special. And you would have to say, to get through the Great War from start to finish, then you have to be well lucky and well trained, but I have to suggest that an awful lot of luck. And so the Old Contemptibles that made it right the way through the war, few and far between.
It's one of those things in history, that phrase "Old Contemptibles" it may not actually be true the way that we portray it, but it could have been true. And in times of war and in times of history, that's usually enough to solidify it in our ongoing memory. So I think Old Contemptibles is a perfect example of that. And I love those phrases that are intended as insults, but then get turned around and worn as a badge of honour. The Rats of Tobruk, is another perfect example, when Rommel referring to the Allies hiding, especially the Australians hiding like rats in the ruins of Tobruk, and then obviously a Rat of Tobruk is now an absolutely huge badge of honour from the Second World War. So I love those little stories. They're important to the history that we remember them, and what they meant to the men in particular. It's unbelievable that they went within 3 weeks from training in their camps in England to being on the front line. Why don't you tell us about some of those early actions they were engaged in and what we're going to be talking about on this walk?
Well, today we're going to be talking about Le Cateau, and that's what it's known as. The town itself is Le Cateau Cambrésis, but everybody just knows this action as Le Cateau. So it's the second action of the BEF, but before we can talk about it, we need to touch upon the first action, which is Mons. I'm not going to go into great detail about the Battle of Mons because it will be featured in a future podcast. So we have basically the Battle of Mons, and we are holding. These are all holding actions. We know right from the start, we're not quite sure exactly how big the German army is, but we know from the start that we're going to have problems in holding the Germans. So the first action at Mons, at a place called Nîmes, and it's on a canal, and we're going to attempt to hold the Germans. One of two locations, but this is the one that everybody really concentrates on. If you know anything about these early actions, it's the Conde Canal, and Lieutenant Dees and Private Godley, who are both going to be awarded the Victoria Cross when they manned a machine gun on a railway bridge and stemmed the German advance. I just need to say this because it's worthwhile commenting upon. We're reassessing all of these early actions of the war. There are a new work being done on them, and I think Peter Hart in one of his podcasts covered it slightly. Is we are reassessing the numbers of casualties because they're too high for the German casualties, and it's a constant reassessment. It's one of the great things about history is we look at it as we get further away, more information becomes available, and certainly in this modern age of computers and web pages and all the other technical devices we can use, we're able to collate a lot more information. So we're reducing the number of Germans killed in these early actions. I'm not going to go into the figures because they will come into that podcast when we talk about Mons itself. So we fight at Mons, we don't hold them, we fall back to Le Cateau, where we're going to be discussing the action today. And this is another holding action, but it's part of a holding action and an ongoing withdrawal. The problem we have, and why this becomes such a crucial battle, is that there is a realisation that we can go no further, really, and we cannot hold here without having a break, without disengaging, because I need to rephrase this. We are in contact with the enemy. In other words, the enemy is pushing us back. We need to break that contact somewhere. And Le Cateau is seen as the place that action needs to take place to be broken. Now, not by French. French is the overall commander in these actions, and he just wants us to continue withdrawing, to continue falling back. But General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien is aware, and he commands 2 corps. 1 corps is commanded by Haig, and he realises that they cannot keep falling back because the men are tired. They need to stop and just draw breath. And he feels that Le Cateau is a place where he can do it, that he can. So he makes that decision off his own back to hold 2 corps on the ridges around the town and to attempt to fight the Germans to a standstill and then break away again, allowing that gap to be created, a gap that will allow the remnants, and you have to say that it is reducing in size constantly, but the British army to withdraw and break contact. So that's what we're going to be talking about, this fight at Le Cateau, to stem the Germans, to give them a bloody nose and allow the rest of the army to withdraw.
And was that plan successfully carried out by the British?
Yes, sorry, there's a bit of a pregnant pause there, because it is, but it's partly accidental in some ways. A very tough fighting, which we're going to be discussing. But yes, it does. It allows the British army to withdraw in a state where it's still under control, so it's not just all over the place. So we withdraw, a strategic withdrawal. It is a retreat, you can't get round it, but it also allows the French to gather themselves, and we get the Battle of the Marne. And the Battle of the Marne is where we stop the Germans from getting to Paris, and that's crucial that the Germans are stopped from getting to Paris.
And was this a costly battle for the British?
It's a very good question. It's costly for all the men that died there, but in the bigger picture, no, it's not. It's not particularly costly for the Germans either. But it's an action that you would have to say we lose. We are losing because we're forced back. We only managed to hold for the morning, so it's a very short period. But it's unbelievable, isn't it? That just a morning made all that difference that we hold for the morning. The casualties, our casualties. I'll give you the figures now. 7,812 casualties. Now that, of course, includes the prisoners of war that the Germans will take, and they took 2,500 prisoners of war. So that just gives you our dead. 7,812, not dead, our casualties. The German casualties, now we used to say, and not that long ago, 9,000. We've now reduced that to 5,000, and there's a belief among an awful lot of historians who have been doing work in the German records that it may be as low as 2,000. So if it's anywhere between the 5 and 2, then you can see that the German casualties are by far less than ours, and we're going to discuss how that happens, why the casualties are particularly heavy, also why we get so many prisoners taken during this action. That's part of what we're going to be talking about.
And before we start the walk, Pete, we're going to get walking in a minute, but just talk a little bit about the artillery as well, because this was quite a fascinating aspect of the fighting, the field guns in action at Le Cateau.
The big issue, and this is where you have to say where Britain has been lagging, the big issue in the use of artillery at this period is that there is still a big belief in the planning of the artillery positions that it gives the infantry confidence if they can see the artillery literally supporting them. So in other words, a lot of the British artillery is direct fire. It's actually looking at the Germans. As the Germans come on, it is going to open fire on them. Now, this is not how you should use artillery at this period. You should have your artillery behind a hill, firing over a hill. You should have a forward observation officer with a field telephone guiding the shots into your enemy as they come on. But this is not what is going to happen. The bulk of the British artillery is going to be placed in the front line and will be firing directly at the Germans, but the German artillery is over the ridge doing what it should do and pounding our artillery, and there's no way that they can respond. Second reason, very, very little aerial observation being used because nobody's quite sure. I have to say, this is a war of movement, remember, and people are not quite sure where everybody is, and so there's a problem with our aerial reconnaissance as well. And the German forwards, observation officers and aerial reconnaissance have picked out where our positions are very clearly, not helped by the fact that we are not using reverse slope positions, in other words, hiding on the back of a hill. Most of our positions are forward slope. It's old school again. Forward slope, we can see the enemy approaching, but they can also see where we're firing from. So the artillery is going to take an absolute pounding throughout the whole of this action. They're going to lose 38 guns will be lost during the fight. But there's some unbelievable acts of bravery to get these guns out of the frontline positions as they are overrun. And the numbers as well, 230 British guns, 550 German guns. But it's not the number of guns per se, it is where we place the guns that is problematic.
Some of the most dramatic accounts of the fighting at Le Cateau is that final phase where the artillerymen rode in horrendous fire on their horses and limbered them up and and pulled the guns out, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But also a fantastic series of paintings were done depicting this. Whenever you look up Le Cateau and look for images, there's not a lot of photographs at this time. The images that generally come up are these wonderful, stirring paintings of the men on these rearing horses, desperate to get these guns out under a hail of fire. So really just dramatic bravery from the artillerymen. And the artillerymen do get quite overlooked. We know how important artillery is to the First World War, but the men and the horses who were responsible for making sure it was in the right position and firing when it needed to, sadly get a little bit overlooked compared to the infantry. So this is one battle where, even though the artillery was poorly used, the bravery of the artillerymen really comes to the fore.
I think there's a couple of things I should add to that. So the artillery all horse-drawn here, but the infantry is also horse-drawn in the sense the men march, but everything else, their machine guns, their heavy overcoats if they need them, their food, the officers all are mounted on horses still. This is still a period when we are a very mobile army. So there are an awful lot more horses than you would expect, even within the infantry battalions serving at this time. So horses are a big part of this battle.
Well, let's begin walking, Pete. That's a wonderful overview. Thank you for that. I think particularly for our Australian listeners, but also perhaps listeners in the UK and Canada and New Zealand and the US, they may not be as familiar with this battle as perhaps the Somme or Passchendaele later in the war. So thank you for that excellent overview. And I'm really excited about this. As I said, it's not an area that I've been to a lot. I've been to this a few times and I've walked a little bit of the ground, but I haven't done it in this sort of detail. So I'm really looking forward to it. So let's strap on our boots and grab our sandwiches and head out onto our walk. Where are we beginning?
Well, we're going to start at a cemetery. It's normally a good place to start. It gives you a good feel of what went on, sadly, by the graves that we're going to be surrounded by. And this is Le Cateau Military Cemetery. It's a very unusual cemetery, sometimes known as the International Cemetery, and that gives you a clue, really. What we have to remember is this area is going to be lost at this period. So 26th of August 1914, this is when this action's taking place. And it will be lost. It will be lost during that day to the Germans and will not be taken back until the end of the war. So this is an area that is not going to be fought over again. It's way, way behind the German lines. And so the burials that take place of those that are killed in 1914 in this battle and the surrounding actions, they are actually going to be buried by the Germans. We had no opportunity to bury anybody. So this cemetery, Le Cateau Military Cemetery, it's a Commonwealth War Graves cemetery, but its original layout is actually a German layout because these soldiers are going to be buried by the Germans. So it's a fascinating cemetery. So we have quite a lot of men from 1914, from this period, and then we have men who died as prisoners of war because this was a hospital area for the Germans from the front line when it's on the Somme, when we're fighting there, and all the way down to the Somme and all the way back up to here. We have to fight those areas, and so the prisoners that were taken that are dying are going to be buried by the Germans as well as they're evacuated, and so they're buried. And then we finally have the men who fought here in the September the October of 1918, and they're going to be buried in this area as well. So we have those guys buried here as well, and there's quite a lot of those. The fighting here was quite stiff as they crossed over these areas, and so they're also buried here. So it's a mishmash, and then of course because it is a German cemetery, the German soldiers bury their dead here. And we have a couple of oddities. We also have a lot of Russians buried here, or in number, perhaps not a lot's not a good term. In fact, there's 34. 34 Russians buried here. So what are they doing here? Well, in fact, they're Russian prisoners of war, captured by the Germans on the Russian front, and being used as labourers. So they were labouring here, and they're going to die predominantly of diseases and bad treatment, I would suggest. And so they're buried here as well. So we have 34 Russian POWs who are buried on this site. It's a dual site. In other words, it is actually, interestingly, totally looked after by the Commonwealth War Graves. So the German graves are also looked after by the Commonwealth War Graves. The whole site is monitored by the Commonwealth War Graves. But it has all those aspects that we see as the difference between a Commonwealth War Graves cemetery and a German cemetery. Lots of trees in German cemeteries, and the lawns are longer. So the grass is always longer, and we can see that very clearly here. The German graves are marked by white stone crosses. So for those of you who haven't ever been to a German cemetery in Belgium or France for the First World War, or in fact the Second World War, they're not all the same. You get steel crosses. Well, actually they look like steel, but they're actually aluminium. So you get aluminium crosses with the names on, so very thin aluminium crosses. You get stones that are set on into the lawns, so low to the ground, stones with names on looking up. You get these, the ones that they have here, these stone-built, stone-carved, or they may even be possibly concrete. I've never been quite sure whether they're concrete or stone-carved. Possibly stone-carved. And they are actually crosses. And so they look like crosses, and they're quite big and quite broad. So we get variations of different type of markers for the German graves. These are, in my view, are the best. They stand out, and they complement almost in a juxtaposition. They look similar but yet different, because these are crosses to the British headstones, as we know, which are headstones where you can actually get that information that a lot of people wanted, that private epitaph written at the bottom. The Germans don't have that luxury. So it's a fascinating cemetery to wander amongst and to go and look at these various aspects of it. And also what we also have are a few German memorials within the cemetery, because this was a German cemetery originally. We get some little quite large obelisks made out of slate, and they are actual German memorials. So there's a lot to look at. You can spend a lot of time wandering up and down, reading the inscriptions on the Commonwealth War Graves headstones, and then looking at the German names and realising that very often they're not dissimilar. There's also something else that was brought to my attention as I started preparing for this podcast. One of my colleagues here has pointed out that he'd recently discovered that in amongst the German graves there is an English name, and he's done a lot of research, and we think that it's an English POW that was buried as a German accidentally, and his name appears on the German headstone. So we're doing a little bit of work, or he is doing a little bit of work on that, some research. So all of these fascinating aspects of cemeteries that make them you cannot avoid spending time in them because they are so interesting.
And even more interesting, Pete, there's a smattering of Australian burials in the cemetery. And we should point out the Australians were nowhere near the fighting that took place in these early stages of the war. I mean, they were in Australia. Soldiers that listed in Australia were still training in Australia at this stage. We're talking here 8 or 9 months before the Gallipoli landing. So we are talking, from an Australian point of view, incredibly early in the war. So how do the Australians end up here?
Well, it's a very good point, and I have to say I always have a look to see if there are any Australians. 6 Australians in this cemetery, but there are going to be more. We're going to be looking at another cemetery towards the end of the walk through the town, which has even more Australians, which is very strange. So here, 6 Australians. I had a look at them all, and you can really partly guess why they're here. They are going to be, in the main, prisoners of war. These are men that were captured at various locations and sadly captured wounded and died as they're moved slowly back. Because everybody gets moved back eventually into Germany, into the prisoner of war camps. And in that movement back, as they move back, sadly, those that have been badly wounded very often have to be taken off their transport and moved to the hospitals, to the field hospitals, and some are going to die. There's also another chap in here, which actually, unbeknown to me, that this is the reason why an awful lot of the Australians are here. He's a transportman and with the artillery, a driver, and he dies of injuries. I looked up his service file, and he actually died of injuries on the 22nd of December 1918. So this is one of the sad aspects, isn't it? We always think of the end of the war, 11th of November 1918. That's it, everybody gets home. When you come to places like this, it becomes very obvious that there is an ongoing trickle of casualties through a variety of reasons. Of course, we're in the middle of the Spanish flu epidemic, something that's obviously that we now perhaps understand an awful lot more about than previously because of what's happening at the moment. So we have casualties from the Spanish flu. We also have men dying of injuries still, the horrible prolonged deaths. But there's an awful lot of men that are dying from reasons that you would die for anywhere in the world. They're being run over, they're having heart attacks, they're dying in accidents of all types, especially when men have got all of this weaponry still around them. So grenades going off, kicking shells by accident, and so a variety of reasons. So we get an awful lot of men that are not going to make it home, even though the war's over. There's also one of the chaps I looked up, Private Peasley. 19th Battalion Australian Infantry, well, he was actually captured at Mont St. Quentin on the 1st of September in 1918, an action we haven't covered yet in the podcast, but we will be doing. And he got all the way from Peronne, being slowly moved back, but will die of his wounds here. So very sadly, he'd been shot in the back and a broken thigh bone. Thigh bones are notorious for shock, for killing you because of the shock of a thigh bone break. So sadly, he will make it no further back than here, and he's buried here as well. We also have a chap that will be awarded the Victoria Cross. He's a British soldier. He did not have his final fight here. He had it elsewhere on the 21st of March, very famous day when the Germans overrun our positions in the German spring offensive, and he was holding the line there, and he will beat off the enemy and do unbelievably. What do you have to say? Something. Look at what they did. Extraordinary acts, and will be awarded the Victoria Cross. But his Victoria Cross will be posthumous because he was captured and will die again on the route back into captivity. So we have a Lance Corporal William Sayer awarded the Victoria Cross, and he's buried in the cemetery as well.
Just reading his what he was from the London Gazette, the citation for his Victoria Cross. Just extraordinary how he fought off those German attacks. And I'll just read a small section of that because I think it sums up very well why he was deserving of that award. So the Germans are attacking the position that he's holding on as best he can with a small group of men, and the citation says, "Though attacked by rifle and machine gun fire, bayonet and bombs, he repulsed all attacks, killing many and wounding others. During the whole time he was continuously exposed to rifle and machine gun fire, but he showed the utmost contempt of danger, and his conduct was an inspiration to all. His skillful use of fire of all descriptions enabled the post to hold out till nearly all the garrison had been killed and himself wounded and captured. He subsequently died as a result of his wounds at Le Cateau." Isn't that extraordinary? Some of these citations, they read like a boy's own adventure novel, and it does paint a picture of just how, particularly on that day, the 21st of March 1918, when the Germans were overrunning the British positions, just fighting tooth and nail to hold them back. Just extraordinary stuff.
It's a date which still makes me shiver. The 21st of March. If you were in the front line, anywhere near the British front lines on the 21st of March, you did not want to be there because the Germans overran most of the positions. So it's an extraordinary day, and one where extraordinary acts took place to try and hold the Germans back, but to no effect. So the Germans overran all of our frontline positions on the 21st of March. So fascinating day.
Well, let's leave the cemetery now. An absolutely fascinating cemetery, one of the most interesting that I've been to, I think. And let's head on to the next site. Which is that, Pete?
I'm just going to talk about one more thing, Matt. Just one more thing before we move off. This, to me, and normally they're interesting, this is a very, very odd memorial in this cemetery, and it's a pyramid. So it's a pyramid larger than myself, so I would suggest probably about 12 foot, maybe twice as high as myself, 12-foot high pyramid on the outside of the cemetery. Actually, it's fairly much linking the British cemetery and the German cemetery. And it's inscribed in both German and French, not in English, so that gives you a clue, nothing to do with the English. And it's basically commemorating the brave soldiers of France and Germany. So it's a joint memorial commemorating the French and the Germans. Now, I've crawled all over this memorial with the view of when was it built and who built it? Because you have to remember, this is 1914, 1918. It's commemorating, and the Germans are going to be back, and they're not going to be doing particularly pleasant things to the population in this area during the Second World War. So I'm not sure that the French will be very keen to put that up during that period or even after that period. And yet this memorial looks to me that it's earlier than that. So when on earth was it built? Well, I think I've worked it out because there's no clues. There are no clues. I think it's definitely German. That's the whole feel of it. It feels Germanic. So it's a German memorial commemorating the loss of German soldiers during the First World War in this area and French soldiers. I think it was put up during the occupation. I think it's an attempt by the Germans to appease the local population by putting up a memorial and saying, look, we may be back again for the second time and we're here to stay this time, so let's start kind of working together, and the first thing we'll do is put up a memorial that commemorates both German and French dead during the First World War. That's the only thing I can think of, because it's not more recent than that. So that's what I'm going to say it is. You'll have to, when you visit yourselves, you'll have to make your own mind up of when you think and who put it up. But I'm fairly certain German put up during the Second World War.
Just extraordinary. We've said it so many times on the podcast that history just keeps repeating in these corners of Europe. And that's an extraordinary example of it, and just the repercussions of both the First and Second World Wars. Good, very good pickup, Pete. I look forward to seeing that again myself when I go there.
It's these little kind of facets of the battlefield that you can miss so easily that actually really bring the stories to life and bring history to life. So I love pointing them out.
Well, it's a great find, Pete. And where are we heading next on the walk?
So we're going to head into town. You can leave your car here if you wish. It's a feral walk. We're going uphill, over the hill, and then down into the outskirts of the town. And this is the outskirts of Le Cateau. So let's just talk a little bit about Le Cateau as to how many people live here. So it's a population of 7,000. Now, I have to say, this is a very attractive town and is massively overlooked by almost everybody. The people that come to the battlefield tend to go to this cemetery. And I should say, what I didn't mention is the cemetery is actually in the heart of the battlefield. It's where the Germans start to attack the ridges, and that's where the British Army's on. So we were in the heart of the battlefield when we stood in the cemetery. So most people stand there, do a little bit of the story, and then they jump in the car and they head towards Mons, or they're perhaps coming in the other direction. They don't even bother to go into the town centre. Le Cateau is very attractive. It wasn't totally flattened, so it's got an awful lot of very old buildings, very well renovated. And it's what a lot of the towns we've talked about, Bapaume, we talked about some of the smaller villages around. It's what they would have all looked like. They were all had a Flemish edge to them. They're all part of the Spanish Netherlands. So we're going back in history again, as we have in previous podcasts when we're discussing this area. It's on the border of Belgium, so very close to the border of Belgium. So right on the hinterlands of France, northern France. It was an attractive town, and it still is an attractive town. So that's the first thing to say. Make the effort to come into the town, because there's an awful lot to see when you come into the town as well. So population 7,000. We're going to walk into the town. The first thing we're going to see is a very, very big building on the left-hand side. Neoclassic. It's called and I'm going to say it in French, so it's the Palais Fenelon. So the Palace of Fenelon, and it's the former second home of the Archbishops of Cambrai. Now, Cambrai is the largest, it's a city, the largest place to hear, and so this town aligns itself with Cambrai, and the Archbishops of Cambrai basically had a holiday home here. That's not quite what it is, but it's a very smart residence here, and they were the people that originally, it was the people from Cambrai who set up this town. So this town, going right back into the annals of history, this is a town that was set up, and it has always been linked to Cambrai. It is now the museum for Henri Matisse, the artist. So it's again, if you've got the time, certainly go and visit the museum. It's the third largest collection of his paintings in France. Of course, it was also used by the Germans. It was a German headquarters during both the First and Second World War, interestingly. So this is the first building that's well worth going to have a look at in the Henri Matisse Museum. So we're then going to walk into the town, and perhaps the next most striking building is actually the town hall, the Hotel de Ville, as it's known. It's very old, 1553 when it was constructed. It's the original building. It's been tweaked, obviously, in that time. A belfry was added in 1705, but it has that look as if it should be nearer to Ypres. Because, of course, it's the same architecture. It is that Flemish architecture. This was a Flemish region, and it was run by the Spanish for a long, long time. It's part of the Spanish Netherlands, so it has that slightly Spanish feel with those Flemish crenellated fronts. That's not quite the term I'm looking for, but I think you'll know what you mean. If you look at the picture of a Flemish house, you'll know what I mean. So, fantastic, beautiful town hall. It also is well worth having. I always go and look at the town halls because they hold the history very often in the town halls. And what we have on the front of it is a list of citizens shot by the Germans during the First World War, which is very sad until you read it. It's all in French, but you have to read it very carefully, and you realise that the majority of these citizens were shot for keeping pigeons. So you think, well, what's that about? Well, of course, what they're talking about is about carrier pigeons. It's the passing of messages. The Germans became obsessed that we were passing information, or that the civilians were passing information to the French, or to, in fact, the British, or to anybody really, that they could pass information to that would then be smuggled back to England. So pigeons were a big thing. Now, what the Germans wouldn't have understood is that a lot of French people in this area kept pigeons. Why? For food. They were a food stock. Rabbits and pigeons always been eaten in the north of France. So a lot of these people kept them. They kept their pigeons. I think you could almost say almost none of them were passing information back to anybody. They were eating the pigeons because food became scarce as the war went on. But it cost them their lives. 7 of the people on this list were executed for having pigeons.
Just a tragic story, and something we probably can't comprehend through the passage of time, just the brutality of the occupation. And we know about the brutality of the occupation in the Second World War, but I think we overlook how the French and Belgian towns that were occupied by the Germans also struggled during the First World War. Not as bad as the Second World War, you would say, in general, but still pretty tough conditions to be occupied for several years.
I think the key here is that the civilian population was still in situ. This is when the German army is moving quickly. Obviously, as we get the German army approaches the Somme, then the population there were aware of what had happened. There were rumours, there were exaggerations, and of course those exaggerations are being used to fire up the men who are going to try and attempt to hold the German army as it advances towards Paris. But what we get is the people there starting to evacuate ahead of the arrival of the Germans. Here they didn't. The civilian population was completely intact in the town. Very few people had left, and it was being viewed a little bit like previous wars where the Germans or the attacking army would be there for a while, they'd smash a few windows and then they'd withdraw, or there'd be some kind of peace treaty or whatever, which would mean that the town life could continue. Here that's not going to be the case. The Germans will not withdraw and they're going to be here for the next 4 years. So they had a long road ahead of them for the civilian population here, which will continue doing what they'd always done. They continued farming, they continued trading. The only thing that changes is they're trading with the Germans, and the Germans are also taking an awful lot. There was a percentage of everything that the farmers grew, and it is, I think, don't quote me on this, but I have a suspicion it's something like 80%. 80% of what they were growing was being taken by the German army for supplying the German army. So they're in for a tough time.
Just a fascinating chapter of the history of the town, Pete. And what else are we going to look at while we're in the town?
Well, we're going to go to a memorial now known as the Suffolk Memorial. It is commemorating the Suffolks, but it's commemorating others as well. But it is where the Suffolks had their last fight during the battle. So it's to the west of the town, so we go towards the school. So if you look for the signs for the school, for those that are walking this route. And it's a difficult one to find. So there's no signage, so you do really need to have found the map that shows where it is. It's just before you get to the school, a little lane on your right-hand side. Walk up there, up out of all the houses, and you can see it ahead of you. There's a few trees around it. It's well looked after. The interesting thing is, and I've just been following a debate about who actually looks after it. It's a squat limestone obelisk. It's big again. It's about 12 foot high, quite squattish though. And it carries the names of regiments and very, very unusually, the names of the dead from each of those regiments. So it names men by names who died in the fighting here, which is extraordinary. I don't recall another memorial that carries the lists of the dead. Partly, you have to say, because for most of the Great War battles that follow this, the lists of the dead are so enormous that they couldn't fit onto a memorial. Relatively speaking, the numbers of dead here, even though they're high for that very small fight for a morning, they're still not a patch on the later actions. So it's beautifully kept. The lawns are cut. But as far as I'm aware, it's not the Commonwealth War Graves. They don't look after it. So I think it's the town. I think the town looks after it and ensures that this looks very nice. Occasionally there are a few bottles and tins up here because the school kids obviously at lunchtime come up here and have picnics around it. But I don't. Generally speaking, it's in lovely condition. So it's known as Suffolk Hill as well, and it is their final fight. It's where the Suffolk the regiment fought itself, well, you have to say, almost out of existence. Remembering that a battalion, so this is the 2nd Suffolk Battalion, and 2nd Battalion of the Suffolk Regiment, much better way of saying it. Normally 1,000 men at full strength. We've perhaps discussed in previous podcasts, they are never at full strength. There's always a cadre of men kept out of the battle, but it will be getting on for full strength here. And by the time they've fallen back to near to St. Quentin, where it's the first time they can call a muster, they can call a roll, there are only 2 officers left, and both of those are, one's a transport officer, the other one organised the whistling of the battalion, so wouldn't have been in the fight anyway. So 2 officers and 111 other ranks. That's all that's left out of the whole of the battalion. So for that, you could say the battalion's wiped out effectively in the fighting in the first months of the war. We are also commemorating on the same memorial the 2nd Manchester Regiment and the 2nd Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. They are all fighting in this area. Interestingly, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry also fought in this area, and they're not commemorated on the memorial. So I don't quite understand why and who was picked. Also, the 15th Brigade Royal Field Artillery is on the memorial, and their men that died are commemorated here. So it's an extraordinary memorial. It's well worth taking the effort to go and have a look at it, and it is in fact the only memorial commemorating the whole Battle of Le Cateau per se. The other memorials are in fact the cemeteries. So well worth having a look at, and certainly it's one that I normally spend quite a bit of time at because you get a view down into the town from it, and you also can't quite see the cemetery that we've come from, the original cemetery that we started off. You can't quite see it, but you can look over that way and get the feel of the German hordes coming towards you here. Now, I read something very interesting only a couple of days ago, that some of these trenches upon here were dug by the local population. So that's interesting, isn't it? That the local population, non-combatants, came out ahead of this action knowing that this could be a stopping point and started digging trenches on this ridge ready for the British Army to fall back to here. Some of the soldiers moaned slightly that the trenches were dead straight, and of course what you need is a zigzagging trench to give you any kind of protection. These were straight. But I just find it interesting that the civilian population, prior to the arrival of the Germans, had become involved in digging trenches. It may be why the Germans took out reprisals on some of the civilian population in the area. But just a fascinating little aspect of the fighting here.
You said the word fascinating, Pete, and I think that's one of the things that's really interesting to me in this area is that we have perceptions about the First World War based on our knowledge of it, looking back through the lens of a century of time having passed. We have perceptions about how the First World War was fought, the mud and the blood and the stalemate and the trenches and the barbed wire. What we have to remember is in places like this, that hadn't happened yet. That didn't happen by chance. That was an evolution that came about later in the war. And none of that had occurred yet. This was the earliest stages of the fighting. No one knew how the First World War was indeed going to look or going to end. And so it was unusual in the context of the rest of the war. And what I'm feeling as we walk around here is there's fascinating little unusual elements to still see that reflect that. As you say, there's unusual little memorials. The cemeteries are laid out in unusual ways. It's reflective of the fact that the First World War hadn't really gotten going yet at this point, and no one knew what was to come.
Ad hoc would be the word, I think, and it feels like that. So that's why I actually enjoy it, because it feels a little bit more ad hoc. And it was Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien that actually unveiled this memorial. So this memorial obviously meant an awful lot to the men who had fought here. Interestingly, it's very hard to find photographs of it. It's very hard to find information of it. And I hope one day to come across a picture of it, of the unveiling of it, but I haven't yet managed to find one anywhere. And it was unveiled on the 26th of May in 1926 by Smith-Dorrien. So he made the effort to come all the way back from the UK, and I'm sure with lots and lots of comrades who'd fought here from the old comrades associations, and they had their commemoration and their unveiling on the 26th of May in 1926.
as you said earlier on, there wouldn't have been too many men that survived all the way through from Le Cateau on for the rest of the war. Perhaps men who'd been wounded in those early actions and evacuated, never came back to the war. But you wouldn't think there'd be too many men who were fighting here in the earliest days of 1914 and then were still here at the armistice at the end of 1918.
It's very interesting when you see photographs, and most battalions had these photographs taken. So photographs of the men that served right the way through from the start of the war or their first battle to the end of the war. And let's take a photo of them. Well, they are not big photographs. It's half a dozen men at the most, and you can fairly much say the transport officer, perhaps the signalling officer, and some of the rear echelon men of the battalion will be there, but the bulk of them are not. So 5, 6, 10, 20 men, those are the ones that were still serving with the battalion. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that everybody else was dead or wounded. A lot of them have been promoted out of their battalion, so they ended up serving the war somewhere else. These are men that served from start to finish, but it's normally just a half a dozen for most of these battalions that were serving here in the early days.
Well, it's a fascinating memorial, Pete. What's next on this fascinating walk around the Le Cateau battlefield?
I'm just going to comment again on something that I've missed earlier on, and it was something that Smith Dorian said, and I just felt it needed saying. This is a quote of his: "When men are too tired to march, they must lie down to fight." And I think that gives you an idea of how exhausted the army was that's fighting here at Le Cateau. Also, I should point out that they hadn't been fed particularly well because all of that was starting to break down, the feeding. The field cookers couldn't get any hot food because they're falling back constantly. In fact, I'm sure some of the field cookers had been abandoned. And so we get an idea that this action that took place on this hill that was standing at the Suffolk Memorial was one of men that were tired, but who still could fire 15 aimed rounds a minute. And that is what is going to hold back the Germans and give them a bloody nose. Now, those units that we've just been talking about, the Suffolks, the Manchester, the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, they did not withdraw when everybody else did. As the Second Corps, 2 Corps were withdrawn, these men either didn't get that information or decided that it had already gone. The attempt to be able to, or the chance of withdrawing had already gone. So most of these units fought it out to the last man. And there's some great first-hand accounts of them. I'm just going to see if I can track one down. So this is just an account, and this is somebody listening back to the fighting taking place on this mound, on this hill, the Suffolk Hill. On the way back, during brief lulls in the shelling, they could still hear the sound of rapid fire in the line, and behind it the faint notes of a bugle. In front of the Argyll and Sutherlanders, the Suffolks, the Germans were sounding the British ceasefire. So the Germans know our calls, and they're trying to get the men to surrender effectively. They're trying to, a combination of trick them to stop firing and then they cause them to surrender. These are the Germans. Some stood up waving and gesticulate to encourage the British to surrender. The Highlanders took aim and coolly picked them off. 2 of their officers, lying side by side, shouted out the hits for all the world as if they were umpiring a shooting competition. They had knocked up quite a score when a detachment of Germans rushed them from behind. They had been fighting for 9 hours, but at last they were overwhelmed. So it gives you that feeling of these men who have decided that they can't easily withdraw. They're going to try and do some good with the last hours of their lives in holding the Germans back, because they knew what it was for. They knew this was to give us time to break away from the Germans and withdraw. And they fought it out to the last man on this ridge where we're standing.
Just stirring stuff. That word "overwhelmed," you hear that used, so it's such a military euphemism. And eventually they were overwhelmed, and what that means, most of them killed, some of them, the lucky ones, captured, killed or wounded, and just the horror of those final moments, really terrible to even contemplate. It
doesn't sound painful somehow when you say overwhelmed, does it?
No, as we said, to try and soften the blow, like forced to withdraw is the other one. Apart from, they didn't retreat; they were forced to withdraw. Where to next, Pete?
So we're going to head back down the road again, so to return back into the town and go and have a look at what else we can find in the town that reminds us of what went on here. I should just add a little bit more about the history of the town. The town itself was famous. Now, it may be famous to some, and especially to those that know their earlier history. But the Peace of Le Cateau Cambrésis was signed in 1559 here at the town. So very famous for those that are interested in the history of that period. And perhaps I should do a future. I keep coming across this date, so I perhaps need to do a podcast about it at some time. And this was a treaty between the rulers of France, England and Spain, ending a 65-year struggle for control of Italy. Now, if you have listened to our previous podcast from Bulcourt, you'll know that I was discussing the 9th Italian War. Well, it's the same war. So that explains it a little bit more, that why we're fighting in an Italian war in this part of the world. It's because we are fighting about who is going to rule Italy. So that's what it was about. And interestingly, that treaty also saw the giving up by England of its last French enclave of Calais. So this is the period of Elizabeth I we're talking about, and we are going to pull out of France at last for the final time as we hand Calais back to the French. It was actually, this area was run, as I've mentioned already, by the Spanish Netherlands up until 1678. So that's why we have a slightly Spanish, Flemish feel to everything that's built here, that's any kind of age to it. And it was eventually ceded to France as part of the Treaty of Nijmegen. Now, again, another name in Holland, Nijmegen, a name that we will hopefully come across in a future podcast, as we'll be talking about the bridges at Nijmegen, a Second World War battle. So you realise that warfare is just all around us, and it does. Sometimes Sarah, my partner, despairs about the human race because you just get these layers and layers of warfare going over and over the same areas.
Just extraordinary stuff. And thank you, Pete, for that extra contribution. As you say, it's important that we understand that the First World War was not the first time that this area was touched by warfare. In fact, the local people were probably well used to it by the time the First World War rolled around, both practically and historically as well. Just an extraordinary area of Europe.
So next thing we're going to come to is a rather stunning statue of a man in full military dress, Napoleonic style dress, and this is a statue of Edward Mortier, who was one of the marshals of the empire. So we're talking about the period of Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was born here in the town, along with, as we've already discussed, Matisse. So he's well remembered in this enormous bronze statue of him. He also became the 13th Prime Minister of France as well, so an important position. The one thing we can't see, and I should state, we are standing on them. As we stand in the square, there's a small square here in the centre of the town. Great, by the way, for getting your Fritz and your beer here. Good place for stopping as you're resting your weary feet. I should also add there's a brewery in the town, which is a very old brewery, which is very famous. I think you can actually organise trips to go and see it. I've never been to see it myself. Perhaps I should. So a very old brewery within the town. But beneath us, as in most towns in northern France, we have vaulted chambers and caves and caverns that sadly we can no longer go into. And apparently there is graffiti from all the walls that were here. They're very beautiful, these underground vaults, very often brickwork and stonework within them, but at present not open to the public. So I'm hoping that at some stage in the future these will become open because they're very historic, I suspect. We can also see fragments of the town walls, which had last been renovated in 1637, and they're over various periods in the history up until the modern times. They've been destroyed, but there are still remnants of the walls, so you can spot little bits of the old town walls all over. And the final thing, non-military, that we should talk about is I have to say, fantastic Church of St. Martin, Decatur, which is just extraordinary. Built in 1634, and it's a Spanish-Flemish influence again. It looks Spanish. It looks like it should be in Spain. It's beautiful. Well worth going to have a look. Again, I've not been inside it, but I suspect it's well worth going to have a look at.
Just extraordinary sights in the town. It is a beautiful town. I've only been there one or two times, but it is a lovely little town and well worth spending a bit of time there. Particularly, you did pique my interest with the comment of beer and frites, and a nice steak and frites and a cold beer is a welcome reward after traipsing the battlefields. But we should stick to the history. not get too distracted, where are we heading to next?
So I always look at these. I just feel that you have to look at them. Now, a lot of people don't bother. This one is particularly beautiful, the Town War Memorial. So this is the War Memorial commemorating all of those Frenchmen who left this town. Remember, left it presumably ahead of the Germans arriving. They would have been actually called up to the French, their army. The men would have been called, so they would not have been in the town when the Germans arrived. And this is the memorial to all of those men that were killed. So it's a beautiful bronze of a female. So it's France depicted as a female holding a wreath in one hand and the flag of France in the other. This is in bronze, gazing down on the body of a dead soldier. So it's a beautiful, beautiful memorial. It's in a place called the Parc Fenelon, and these names sometimes of the roads give it away. Rue de Poilu, so de la Grande Guerre. So effectively the road of the soldiers of the Great War, where it's where the memorial is. So it gives you a clue. And on the back of it, I always look at the back of these things. There is a fantastic little bronze depicting a German light Renault tank going into action against the Germans, with the French cheering behind it as it runs over a group of Germans. So I always like little images of the French Renault tank. The French are very proud of their little light tank that they produced in the war, very successful tank. So that's depicted on the back of the memorial. And this one was inaugurated in 1923. I read an account just recently that it was inaugurated, but the bronze wasn't actually on the memorial when it was inaugurated because it hadn't got there in time. So things don't change. That's a fairly common occurrence nowadays. It arrived slightly later, but it was inaugurated in 1923.
Only a few stops left on the walk, Pete, now to cover the battlefield of Le Cateau. What's coming up next?
One of the things before we leave the centre of the town that I must just suggest that you pop in to go and have a look, and I can't even tell you anything about it because I've been unable to find anything about it other than the fact it was donated to the town, and it is a British field gun from the 1950s. So after the First World War, and I've actually seen it in a couple of guidebooks, just literally commented upon as a First World War field gun. It certainly isn't. So well worth just pop in the library and go and have a look at it. That's all I can suggest, because very little information about why it's there, other than it's obviously commemorating a battery that fought here during that action. Just a few more things to look at before we leave the town and head off to the final cemetery that we're going to look at, and that is a very odd divisional memorial. The 66th British Division commemorated its men here. And how did they commemorate the men? Well, it's a stone horse's drinking trough that is in the centre of the town. And you may think, why on earth would they do that? Well, of course, horse is still a big part of life, and I think the division felt they wanted to rather than a memorial, just a memorial, to put something in that was useful to the town. Now, it's no longer used as a horse's drinking trough. It's got flowers in it, so it's very attractive. And on the front is emblazoned in memory of those of the 66th Division of the British Expeditionary Force who fell in the liberation of Le Cateau from German occupation in October 1918. So I think it's a great little, very small, low-key memorial commemorating the 66th Division. Just as a matter of interest, the battalion that got into the town the first were the 5th Connaught Rangers, so an Irish battalion, were the first infantry to get into the town in the October. Just before we get to the cemetery, and this is the communal cemetery, the town communal cemetery, we have another very sad memorial. This is known as the Execution Memorial, and it's commemorating the execution of 5 civilians on the 27th of November 1914. So just a little memorial, and it lists the names of those again who were killed at that period. And it is really the Germans stamping on the civil population early on in the occupation to say, don't do anything because we're not going to put up with it. So very, very sad in many ways. And then we're going to move into the civil cemetery. Now, the civil cemetery, Le Cateau Communal Cemetery, contains a number of graves. It's got an enormous 15-foot wall around the cemetery, so I think they were worried about body snatchers. And there are 150 soldiers of the Great War in the Commonwealth War Graves sector. Well, they're actually scattered around it, but they are buried within the cemetery, of which 101 of them are identified. Now, this is where it gets slightly odd. 13 of those men are Australians, of the named men, the 101 who are named. And to me, that really surprised me as to why there were 13 Australians here, because they certainly wouldn't be involved in the fighting in 1918. As far as I was aware, all Australians had been pulled out of the front lines on the 6th of October, and here we are a lot later than that, and it's nowhere near here. But they are all men who died in the December of 1918. So these are men dying of what I stated earlier. So 13 Australians. I haven't looked at them individually, and I must do, because I'll be interested to find out exactly what they are dying of. And it's all different dates. There's no set dates. So these are men who are dying in the rough and tumble of that period after the war, before they are going to find their way on their boats back home to Australia. So very sad, 13 Australians all dying in December, buried in the little local cemetery here. So just extraordinary.
As you said earlier, Pete, in the discussion, it was just a tragedy that the war was over. These men, should have been looking forward to heading home, and instead they're meeting their fate. They're still dying in not insignificant numbers right up until the very end of 1918 and well into 1919 as well, sadly.
Yeah, just very, very sad. The other thing that I need to point out here, because there's an extraordinary, again, it's the carrying on with that connection to Australia, is that in the fighting here, and of course we as was mentioned earlier, Australians not even fighting at Gallipoli yet, and will not arrive until 1916 onto the Western Front in France. And yet here we have an Australian soldier being killed or being mortally wounded and dying a day later. At the Battle of Le Cateau. And he was Lieutenant William Chisholm, and he was serving in the 1st East Lancashire Regiment, 11th Brigade, 4th Division, 3rd Corps, so right in the thick of the fight of the fighting as they're withdrawing. Actually, they became involved as they start to withdraw. And he had been wounded on the 27th, and he died the following day, and he's buried at a place called Linney en Cambrésis. And he is now recognised as the very first Australian to die in the First World War. So he'd been born and raised in Australia. In fact, he went to Sydney Grammar School, but his family will move to England in 1910. He moved with them. His father was actually a surgeon, an eminent surgeon. And he will go to the British Military College and eventually join his regiment and be sent out to the Great War. In fact, he died, or he was mortally wounded in his very first day of combat. So very, very sad, really. It gets even sadder because in 1928, his father and one of his other sibling came out with his mother's ashes because his mother had never really recovered from his death. She was her first son, and her ashes are now buried alongside him in the civil cemetery at a place, as I said, called Linney en Cambrésis, and they now lie together. And in fact, their family home in, now Matt, you will have to correct me on this, Woollahra.
Woollahra, very, very good, mate. Woollahra.
It was close. Their family home was actually called Linney because of the loss of their son in the town. So very, very sad story, but interesting that this is where the first Australian sadly was mortally wounded and will die the following day.
It's a great story, and Chisholm's rifle is on display. If you're in Sydney, he was from New South Wales, and obviously, and his rifle is on display at the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park in that wonderful new museum there. And a shout out to Brad Manera, the director of that wonderful memorial, and the great work he did on the rebuilding of the museum now underneath the memorial in Hyde Park. So go, definitely, if you're in Sydney, go to. It's now open again thanks to COVID restrictions. It's now open again, so definitely, if you're in Sydney, go and see the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park and the wonderful new museum. And hopefully Brad Manera will be there to say hello and show you around. But just extraordinary, and you'll get to see Chisholm's rifle, which is on display there as the first Australian killed during the First World War. Just really fascinating stuff, and we should remember that, Pete, that we talk about Australians fighting in a specific area and British soldiers fighting in a specific area. We should always remember that they may, when we say British or Australian or Canadian, we're talking about the national representation. It doesn't mean that the men from fighting in those units are all from that country. And in fact, I've read statistics that 1/3 of all the men who fought in the Australian military in the AIF were from Britain. We don't realise how much people moved around even a century ago. We seem to think it's a modern phenomenon, but it absolutely wasn't. People moved all over the world, particularly throughout the British Empire. So we had Britons and Scots and Irishmen living in Australia. We had New Zealanders living in Canada. We had Canadians living in India. And these people would then join the local units when war was declared and go off and fight, and in many cases die. So never forget that there was a huge mix of nationalities contained within all of these units.
I often just describe them as men of the empire, because I don't think they settled. They went where the money was, effectively. So whether they be gold miners or sheep shearers or whatever business they were, sailors, whatever business they were employed in, they very often spent time around the empire wherever they thought they could make a little bit of money, and then moved on again. And when the Great War started, wherever they were, that's the units that they joined.
One of the probably the most famous examples from an Australian perspective is the archetypical Anzac, the good Aussie bloke Simpson with his donkey in Gallipoli.
Absolutely.
One of the most famous Australians. Simpson was from South Shields in England. He from the north of England. He spoke with such a strong accent that the Australians called him Scotty, because they thought he was Scottish. His northern English accent was so strong. So he was a Geordie through and through. So one of the men that is considered the most famous of all Australians in wartime, Simpson, was not even Australian. Just a fantastic demonstration of the empire and the men who roamed all over it, and then did their bit when they were called to. When the war broke out, wherever they were, they joined their local unit and went off and fought and died with those. I'm also reminded that at Thiepval, the famous British memorial on the Somme that records men killed in the Somme, there are no Australian units recorded on that memorial. However, there are 55 Australians who are recorded on the memorial who were killed while fighting with British units. So we should just never forget. Chisholm's a great example of that. We should never forget the international nature of the men who are fighting as part of the British Empire.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Pete, it's been a wonderful journey through a battle that, it doesn't get as much attention as it should compared to the Somme and Passchendaele and these other great conflicts of the First World War. And I'm just really pleased that we had a chance to virtually walk across these fields. And I look forward, mate, once we can, to getting out and doing it for real. Just thank you so much, Pete, for your insights into this. It's as always, it's been wonderful.
No, it's been nice to talk about it, because I think it's somewhere that certainly for an awful lot of people who go to the popular sites of the Great War go a little bit off piste occasionally, and this is one of those sites that definitely could do with a few more tourists to go and have a look at it when we can travel again. It's a great little battlefield, but it's also a great little town to go and explore.
Very well said, and that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for tuning in. If you like what you're hearing, please support us. Go online and send us a message through Twitter or Facebook. We now have Twitter and Facebook pages dedicated to the BattleWalks podcast, so look those up on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you very much to Sarah, your partner Pete, who put those up, and we'll be maintaining those and adding photos from every episode of the podcast. So go and find BattleWalks on Twitter and Facebook. Send us a message. Also, as always, if you're enjoying the podcast, please review it wherever you get your podcast, particularly on Apple Podcasts. That's very important to the ongoing success of everything we're doing. Thank you for joining us, Pete. Thank you for joining us on BattleWalks.
No, it's been great. I'm looking forward to getting some of the photographs of some of the sites that we're talking about, because I think it will help. It will help people to have an understanding if they can see a little bit more about what we discuss.
Absolutely, and we'll see you next week.